Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for attending this talk. I would like to give my final presentation about this summer internship project. I will talk about DIABLo, which is a deep individual-agnostic binaural localizer. Okay, let me maybe minimize this. Okay, so what is binaural localization? Humans, we can localize sound by only using 2 ears. And so this is called binaural hearing. This binaural hearing consists of a couple of elements. So one is the physical phenomena, which happens outside of our head. And then there's the perceptual aspects, which happens inside our head. So the physical part is governed by physical acoustics. So if there's a sound source at a certain direction, the signal, the sound pressure received at the entrance of the ear canals has a certain color, which is dependent on the direction. So, and this is due to scattering by the head and the ear. And the result of this acoustic scattering is summarized in the acoustic impulse response, which is called head-related impulse response. And there are some features which are included in this HRIR, such as the intraoral time difference, intraoral level difference, or intraoral phase difference. And then there are the monaural spectral cues. So these are the things which are included in the signal which happens outside of the head. And then we have the our experience. So we have immediately after our birth, we learn how to localize sound. And basically that's a process of supervised learning, because we have also eyes. We can see the sound source position, and that's sort of a supervised signal which we can learn how to localize sound. And a binaural localization model is a computational model for doing this, the part which happens inside our head. So it's a machine which is trained to localize sound given an arbitrary binaural signal as input. And applications of such models include robot audition, sound scene analysis given sequence of binaural audio, and evaluation of black box binaural rendering engines, and potentially replacing humans in subjective localization tests. And it could be used to study human binaural hearing, and some authors apply it to binaural source separation. Okay, there's a long history of binaural localization models. The earliest ones came out in the late 80s and early 90s, right after the first wave of artificial neural networks. And before that, biologists have studied this binaural hearing way earlier than that. And I do not go into all the history, but focus on the most relevant literature. But before that, let me first introduce some terminology, because it can be a bit confusing. So by subject, I mean a human subject, or a dummy head or a HUDs, or some mesh data, which is associated with a single head and ear shape, which generates a collection of measured or simulated HRIRs. And an HRIR catalog is a collection of HRIRs from multiple directions associated with a single subject. And then there's a HRIR dataset, which is a collection of HRIR catalogs from multiple subjects, which is captured or computed in the same way. And then I use the term HRIR database, which is a collection of HRIR datasets. So there's this hierarchy of data which we use. Okay, so this is a summary of the most relevant and most recent works on this in this field of binaural localization models. It can be categorized by various axes. So one is the direction coverage of the model. So there are many models which focus on the horizontal plane only, or sagittal plane, or some subset of the sphere, for example, the frontal hemisphere or the upper hemisphere. And some models are restricted to a certain range, which is defined by a given HRIR dataset. And then there's another aspect, which is the training scheme. So most of the models, existing models, are trained on a single subject. But there's another way of training such models, which is the individual-agnostic scheme, which is one of the unique characteristics of the proposed model. And then there are various different input audio types used for training and testing these kind of models. Earlier works have used band-limited noise or band noise or white noise, but more recent works are using mainly speech. And then there's an axis of the acoustic condition. Either it can be a anechoic room without noise or reverb, but realistic data is noisy and has reverberation in it, so that's a more realistic setup. Then there's a different different choice of output format. The earlier works here in this list use a directional activation map, so which is basically some grid defined on the sphere or projected on a rectangle, which is a map of activations. So if there's a bright spot on that map, that means that there's a sound source on that position. And recent works tend to use treat it as a classification problem. And in that case, the output is a one-hot vector encoding the direction, which can be either the azimuth or elevation or lateral or polar angle. And there are various different ways of testing such models, and the most realistic setup is using binaural recordings, but some works use only HRIRs, synthesized binaural signals using HRIR datasets or BRIR, binaural room impulse response datasets. And there can be tests on using such models for multiple sources or moving sources. And yeah, so our model tries to cover most of these elements which have been studied in the past. But I will go into that later. So this is a summary of the available HRIR datasets. They have various numbers of subjects or number of directions, and they usually have different direction grids for which the HRIRs are captured. And only very recently there have been two datasets introduced which cover the full sphere for the first time. So that's very nice. We can utilize these datasets to train a model which covers the entire sphere. And another thing to mention is this latest dataset in this list. This is a fully simulated dataset, so it doesn't use real-world measurements, but relies on acoustic simulation. Okay, and so these are the different direction grids from these for these datasets, and so these in the blue box, these are the recent ones which cover the entire sphere, and the older ones, they tend to have a small hole or sometimes a very large hole at the bottom. Yeah, so that's the difference. So we train our model using speech data, but it is known in this context of binaural localization or spatial hearing that higher frequency spectral cues with frequencies above 6 kilohertz are important for the localization of polar angle or a localization in the sagittal plane. So therefore, we want to use a speech data set which has high frequency components. And we decided to use this grid data set, which has a pretty high sampling rate. We initially also used this another data set called CSTR-BCTK, but it turned out that this data set, some audio clips from this data set are used in one of the test data set to generate the audio clips of the test data set. So we excluded this from training. Okay, so this is a list of the binaural room impulse response datasets and binaural recording datasets, which we use for testing our models. And we decided to use 3 of these. One is a dataset from the University of Surrey, which contains 4 rooms and 1 anechoic room condition. And this one is used in various related literature, so we decided to include this. And then we also use this 22.2 channel dataset from the University of Surrey. This is a dataset which contains not only data from the horizontal plane, but also from different elevation angles. And the great thing of this dataset is also that they rotated the dummy head when capturing the data, so it has very many different directions contained in the dataset. And for the last test, we used a dataset from the Locata Challenge corpus, which contains binaural recordings with position tracking data. So it has nice labels, and it has various different conditions, such as static sources or moving sources and single or multiple sources, and so on. Yeah. Okay. So this is a little bit more detailed explanation of these datasets, these datasets, one characteristics of these datasets is the reverberation time. So one of the reference works report that the binaural localization model that they developed is very susceptible to reverberation in the test data. So if you have more than 500 milliseconds of T60, then your localization accuracy significantly drops. So this is a result for their model. So it's not clear if this is also true for our model or other models, but yeah, this is known. So this reverberation time is one important factor of these test data sets. And yeah, so it ranges from T60 of 890 milliseconds, and the shorter data set has only 230. Yeah, and so on. Okay. So let me describe the scope of our project. The goal is to develop a general purpose binaural localizer, which should have the following characteristics. It should be able to localize sound coming from arbitrary directions, so not only the horizontal plane or median plane or some subset of the spheres, like some hemispheres, but we want to have a model which works on the entire sphere. And it should work with arbitrary type of input signal. So it shouldn't only work with white noise or band noise, but also with natural sounds such as most typically speech. And the third point is it should be agnostic to the generation process of the binaural signal. So we don't want to assume any a priori knowledge about the generation process of the binaural signal. So it should be able to handle any recordings from any HATs or any binaural recording which was measured for any individual. Yeah, the fourth point is it should be robust to disturbance, so it should handle input sound with noise or reverberation. And it should be extendable to more challenging tasks, such as multiple source localization or moving source localization. So yeah, so we use therefore a source number independent and a sequential output format for to handle such cases. Okay, so this is showing the training scheme of our model. So we have two sources of input data, which is the input speech, and we have the HRIR, the input responses. For the speech data set, we have 90,000 segments of 1 second. And we have about 2,000 subjects in the HRIR database, and roughly speaking, in average, about 2,000 directions for each subject. So this number depends on the data set, so this is just an rough numbers, but about that scale. And so we convolve this signal, which gives the by the way, yeah, we quasi-uniformly sample ground truth direction on the sphere and use that direction, the HRIR from that direction here. So after convolving these two components, we get the clean binaural audio signal. And so here we add the reverberation, the binaural room impulse response, which is prepared separately as a database. So this is a synthesized data set based on the image source method using the HRIRs included in the data set in the HRIR database. So for each HRIR data set, 7,000 BRIRs are computed, and we use the same splitting of training and validation data sets. So we do not, if the HRIR data set is used for training, that's not used for validation, and the same the BRIRs which use that training data set, HRIR data set, is not used for validation. Okay, so now we have the reverberant binaural audio, and it's not included in this picture, but we also add the stereo additive white noise to this signal. Okay, and that is the input binaural audio for the model. Then we have the preprocessor. I will describe in the next slide what this does. And after preprocessing, we get a three-dimensional tensor, which is a spectrogram with 3 channels, and that's fed into the DNN localizer. I will also describe the architecture of the localizer in the next slide. And this DNN localizer outputs a direction map, which is a matrix, D times T, D by T matrix, where the D is the number of direction bins defined on the sphere, and T is the number of time frames. Okay, and so from the ground truth direction data, we also create this ground truth direction map, which looks like this. And we use the multivariate binary cross entropy loss to train this deep neural network. And so basically we train a collection of binary classifiers. So each direction has a classifier which decides the presence or absence of our sound source in a specific direction. Okay, so this is the architecture here in the right of the neural network. It is a 2-legged convolutional neural network adopted from one of the reference works from Yang et al. And so we use the same input feature, which is as I said here, it's a spectrogram of 3 channels. 2 of those channels are the stereo log magnitude spectrograms, and the 3rd channel is the interaural phase difference spectrogram. And these magnitude spectrograms and the interaural phase difference spectrograms are processed by these 2 independent convolutional neural networks, which have 6 layers. Sorry. Yeah, okay. So, and after those 6 layers, it is concatenated and fed into a fully connected network, which gives this output map, which has 2048 direction bits. Yeah, one comment on the additive signal. So for the stereo white noise, we use uniformly sampled, signal to noise ratio, which is uniformly sampled from 20 to 40 decibel. And the BRIRs are computed for random room size and wall reflectance conditions, and up to 20 reflections. So the preprocessor processes the input audio using STFT window size of 512 samples and hop size of 120 samples. And the Kaiser window with beta 4 is used as a window function. So for the training, we use 1,240 shapes from the Cheddar dataset, and that for each shape, there are the HRIR data included for 3 distances. And we mix that, so this is a fully simulated data set. We mix that with the measured data sets, 5 of the measured data sets. And we use another data set for validation, which is the HATAPS data set. This is another measured data set. And we use 13 subjects from this as for the validation. Okay. For the optimizer, we use an algorithm called ADAMOD, which is a modified version of the famous ADAM algorithm. And one important feature of the training scheme is the use of soft targets. So this is a technique which is sometimes used to, if you want to detect some signal which is strongly localized in time or space, it is sometimes beneficial to use this soft targets technique. And because we want to detect data, signals which is localized in the some direction on the sphere, we use a spherical function, which is called the von Mises-Fischer probability density function. So it has, it is sometimes also called the spherical Gaussian function. Spherical Gaussian distribution. So it has a parameter which controls the width of this distribution. So and at the very initial stage, I use a very soft target, but that's and during the process of the training, it is shrinked, and at the final as the final value, I use this parameter is here it's described as tau, but I think it's more popular to call this kappa. So I use this kappa parameter of 512 as a final state of this soft target. Okay, so I would like to describe the experiments that we have conducted. So first, we have 6 different conditions, 6 different cases as ablation cases. So in one case, we do not add the noise during training. In the second case, we do not add the reverb, the synthesized reverb during training. The third case, we do not add we do not add noise nor the reverberation. The fourth case is instead of using the hi-fi speech as input, using a low-pass filtered band-limited speech. In the fifth case is instead of using speech, only using white noise as the source signal. And the last one is instead of using the soft target, which I just explained, using only hard targets. And then we also compared it with some baseline methods which are more common. Well, the first one is pretty the most common. So instead of using the multivariate binary cross entropy for this training, using the categorical cross entropy. So basically assuming a single source and treating it as a classification problem of those 2048 direction classes. And the second baseline case is the use of a multitask categorical cross entropy loss, which was recently used by in this paper by Yang et al. So what they did is they used the same two-legged convolutional neural network, but instead of having a single output, the direction classes, they have two separate outputs. One is the one-hot vector encoding the lateral angle, and the other one is the one-hot vector encoding the polar angle. And so they use the loss function, which is the average of those of the two categorical cross entropy loss functions. So this is one case which we compare, and then we compare our model with various single subject models. So instead of using the individual agnostic training scheme, but using many single subject models, and we also compare it with an ensemble of single subject models. And as performance metrics, we use two different metrics. One is the mean angular error. So the angular error is the angle between the ground truth direction and the estimated direction. And the mean is taken over all the directions included in the test set. For this, we have two variants. One is the total mean angular error, so which is the total angle, which I just explained. And the second case is the lateral mean angular error, which only looks at the lateral error. And the second class of the metrics is the accuracy, so which is essentially the number of localization successes over the number of all the trials. And here the success of a localization is sort of arbitrarily defined, but we use 10 degrees as a threshold for the total error. So if the total angular error is less than 10 degrees, it's treated as success. And for the lateral case, it's 5 degrees used as the threshold. Okay, so before going into all the numbers, I would like to show a typical output of the network. So these are the results for the Locata test set. We have 13 columns here in this matrix plot. So each column represents a result of a single test case, test input audio data. So we have 4 rows. The 2 rows at the top are showing the model output, so the output map of the model. And the 2 at the bottom are the ground truth direction maps. And the first and third row is showing the left hemisphere of these the spherical output map, and the second and fourth are showing the right hemisphere. So one interesting thing here is that we get these kind of ring structures as the output, as a typical output response of the network. And these rings correspond to the points which have the same lateral angle. And so this phenomenon is sort of very well known in psychoacoustics, or in psychoacoustics. If humans localize sound, the localization of lateral angle is relatively easy, but localization within this ring, which is called cone of confusion in the field of psychoacoustics, this is much more challenging. And this fact is here naturally emerges here in these output maps. So it is pretty certain, the model is pretty certain that about the lateral angle, but it's not so certain about the polar angle. Sorry. Okay. And yeah, so as I said, the output of the model is a matrix, a D by T matrix, and where again D is the number of the direction bins and T is the number of time frames. And for the decision of the direction of the sound source, we take the maximum over time and take the argmax over the direction bin. So that's treated as a estimated source direction for a single static source case. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So this table represents the results for the total mean angular error. Okay, so we have here three blocks. In the first block, the result of the proposed baseline model and the result for the ablation studies are shown, and the comparison with the baseline methods. In the second and third blocks, there are these results for the single subject models. And okay, first we notice that that by removing reverberation during training, the performance significantly drops. And the same for white noise only training. If we don't use speech at train time, then the performance significantly drops. Yeah, interestingly, with band limited speech, the drop was not that significant. And when we compare it with the other loss functions, so when we first use the hard targets instead of the soft targets, we get a pretty significant performance drop. And when we use the categorical cross entropy for training, it also drops performance. And also with a multitask training scheme, it also dropped performance. Oh, by the way, sorry, I should first explain what each of these columns mean. So the first two columns represent the data for seen HRIRs. So the HRIRs which are seen during training, which are used as part of the training set, are shown here in the first block. And there are two columns. One is the clean condition, so where no noise or reverberation is added for this at this evaluation time, and the case with noise and reverberation. And the second block here is the case of unseen HRIR data, again for the two clean and noisy reverberant conditions. And the next block is showing the three test data sets. At the very right, I have shown here the average of the three tests and the maximum so the worst case of these three test cases. Okay, and so if we look at the single subject models, we notice that the models trained using this cheddar dataset, they perform very good at this one test dataset, which is the Locata task 1, but it performs very poorly on the other 22.2 channel dataset. So in average, one model outperformed the proposed model in terms of average test mean angular error, averaged over the three test sets again. But in terms of the maximum of the test mean angular error, our proposed model had the smallest worst case value, so which means which indicates the robustness of the model. And by the way, we also have tested an ensemble of these individually trained models, and yeah, so basically that it has a similar trend like these individual models. It perform, the numbers are better if you compare it with a simple average of these numbers. This is the cheddar average row here. It's the ensemble model is much better than that, but it did not outperform our proposed model. And if we look at the other data set, the HATOPS data set, the single subject models using subjects from those data set, those had a much worse performance. So now if we look at the lateral mean angular error, basically we have the same trend. Again, the Cheddar single subject models are pretty good on this specific task. But again, if we look at the maximum, the worst case mean angular error, our model was found to be the most robust. But in this case, in the case of lateral mean angular error, actually the ensemble model of this Cheddar individual models has delivered the best performance. Although the numbers are pretty small in the case of lateral localization. Lateral localization is much easier than, as I said, localization in the polar angle. So the numbers are already pretty small. So the difference is also not that significant. But yeah, this has delivered the best performance here. And okay, so if we look at the accuracy. Yeah, basically, again, the trend is the same as the total mean angular error. But again, our proposed model has, again, the best worst case performance over the test cases. And if we look at the lateral accuracy, yeah, the basic trend is the same. But in this case, we found that one of the HATOPS single subject model delivered the best, the best worst case performance. Although this model has much worse performance on the other data sets. So yeah, so if you look at the average performance in this case, our proposed model had the best number. Okay, so the next, I would like to demonstrate some more challenging applications of this binaural localization model. So in this case, oops. Oh, okay. So I I intended this to appear after clicking some clicks. I wanted to do a quiz, but now we already see it. Anyway, okay. So I wanted to ask how many sources do you hear in this audio clip? Oh, maybe I haven't shared audio. Let me go back. Oops. I cannot stop sharing.
Let me try if I can grab control and give it back to you.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I should have done it at the beginning. Is it maybe because it's recorded, I cannot stop sharing? Or?
I'm not sure. Try sharing. You stopped sharing, so try. Oh, you did not.
No, it doesn't.
You may have to leave the call.
I think we lost Shoken. Copy. there are any questions in the meantime while we wait for Shoken to come back, I can try to field those. It looks like he's trying to reconnect, but having some issues. Any questions on anything we've seen so far? One thing I thought I could add, while we wait for Shoken to return, the results on the test data sets, where some of the models that were trained on a single HRTF seem to perform quite well. I think one thing to bear in mind with those results is that the test data sets there were 3 different test data sets, but they were recorded with just 2 different dummy heads. And so theoretically, you could get lucky if you have enough individually trained HRTF models, you could get lucky with an HRTF that is quite close to the dummy head that was used in testing, and then get quite performance for that particular dummy head or for that particular test set. But as we saw in the results, that the single subject trained HRTF models, they didn't seem to generalize quite as well. And that's one of the downsides of performing this training on just a single subject rather than trying to perform a more agnostic training, which then should lead to an individual agnostic model, which is what Shoken is proposing here. Okay, looks like we have you back, Shoken.
Yeah, sorry, I had issues with Teams. I had to restart Teams, sorry. Okay, so I'm back. So let me play back this example audio.
It's just like the stock market.
I draw a field bubble on my face.
There could still be some to come forward.
Yeah, so I guess this was not so difficult. So there are 3 sources.
It's just like the stock market.
I draw a field bubble on my face.
There could still be some to come forward.
Yeah, so there are 2 on the left and 1 on the right. This is, by the way, the output activation map of the model projected onto a rectangle using equi-rectangular projection. So we see again the rings of confusion are distorted because of this mapping, but we see these 3 rings of confusion. And if we plot it in terms of lateral and polar grid, then these rings of confusion become straight vertical lines of confusion. And yeah, so this, if we have multiple sources, we get these multiple stripes on this output map. And this is another example. Again, we see the solution. It has.
It was the 80s.
I didn't feel it.
The city council
A change in that position would require a.
Yeah.
It was the 80s.
I didn't feel it.
The city council.
A change in that position would require a.
Yeah, so in this case, there were 4 sources, and in this case, the model sort of hasn't really detected the 4th or one of the sources. Yeah, but it still has detected 3. By the way, during training, all the up to 2 sources have been used during training. Yeah, but it still sort of detects more than 2 sources. So these are the results for 2 source input audio. Yeah, it detects multiple, yeah, in this case 2 vertical lines, and in the case of 3 sources, yeah, similarly. Well, at some cases, if the lateral angle is close, it's not really clear how many there are, so that might be challenging to post-process. But yeah, like this. So this is a result for 4 sources.
I think, Shoken, just briefly, it's important to note here that the model doesn't know the number of sources, so there is no a priori knowledge about the sound seen. It's the raw output of the model, just on the binaural input.
Exactly, and by the way, I forgot to explain one thing. So the black circles here represent the ground truth directions. Okay, and so this is another demonstration, this time using moving sources. So let's have a look.
Life was like a timetable. She is employed on short-term contracts. They have now been banned from Celtic Park for life. The director will be present. Clark was desperate to return to the House of Commons. If we cannot succeed in this endeavor, then so.
Okay, so yeah, it successfully finds the lateral angle, as was the case in the multiple source case, and yeah, it's somehow yeah, it has a broad range of activation in the polar direction, so that's yeah, much more challenging than identifying the lateral angle. But actually, but my impression when looking this was, if the polar angle activation is slightly off, for example, in this case, but it sort of matched my perceptual my perception of. So if the speaker was moving to this, walking to left, I sort of had the impression that the sound is coming from the above, and if the speaker comes back, I sort of had the impression that the sound source is lower, and maybe that's also related with the where the speaker is looking at. So the source directivity may be related here. Yeah, but so that was one demonstration, and let's look at another one.
It is vital to clarify their role. It appears that it was just a genuine mistake. They are determined to make a meaningful contribution, says the Duke of York. That's not fair to the supporters. They need to look after themselves. I've always been like that.
Okay. Okay, so one last check or test of the model. It would be interesting to see how such a binaural localization model would perform if the input was not a binaural audio, not a true binaural audio, but some sort of pseudo binaural audio. And by pseudo binaural audio, I mean stereo audio clips, which are created using amplitude panning or delay panning. So these panning techniques are very classical techniques to mimic the interval level difference or interval time difference. And it's a very fundamental technique of stereo audio production, as everyone knows. So how would a binaural localization model, which was trained only on HRIRs, so I mean real binaural audio, or yeah, maybe cannot be called real if you're using HRIRs, but at least it's not just a panned signal, it has all the spectral characteristics during training. So what would happen if we feed a such as pseudo binaural audio to the model? And the results are here. So if we use delay panning to create the stereo signal, those results are the two plots at the top. And at the y-axis, the x-axis is the ITD. The y-axis is the estimated lateral angle, so the output of the model, the result of estimation. And in the second plot is the estimated polar angle. So we see that the estimated lateral angle has very, there's some outliers, but very clean straight line. So it, from this we can sort of see that the model has learned to associate the ITD with the lateral angle. And yeah, it's sort of interesting to see that if the ITD was the only component of the stereo signal, then it tend to localize the sound on top directions. And instead of if the amplitude panning is used, which is more common than delay panning, then we again get a sort of a correlated curve, but in this case it has a very noisy and also stepwise feature. Yeah, so basically this is about all the results, so I would like to conclude. So we developed a deep individual-agnostic binaural localizer, which covers the entire 4-pi sphere, and no a priori knowledge about the recording time HRIRs is required to use this model or train this model. It was tested with real binaural recordings under noise and reverb, and we have demonstrated that it can be extended to multiple moving sources. So we have observed good lateral angle localization. The worst case mean angular error 6.3 degrees, and the total mean angular error not higher than 28.6 degrees on the test data sets. So these numbers were better than the reference methods using categorical cross entropy based learning or multitask loss based learning. And it was also found to be more robust than picking a random single subject model or and yeah, it is also much cheaper than forming an ensemble of single subject models. And also, I mean, not only at train time, but also at inference time. The agnostic model is just a single model, which is much cheaper. And it also tend to have better or comparable localization performance. Yeah, and also training with speech and reverb was found as a crucial component. So as future research topics, I would suggest to create a larger test data set. So we found during this project that there are very limited test data sets for this kind of problems. Either the number of directions is limited or limited onto the horizontal plane, and also the number of subjects or the number of dummy heads incorporated in the data set is pretty limited. So yeah, developing more larger test data sets would definitely help to have the studies in this field. Another important subject is to improve ball angle localization, which is, as we have seen, a pretty challenging aspect, but yeah, it's one important topic. And yeah, then refining the model for multiple and moving sources could be an interesting direction. So maybe using recurrent layers or probabilistic post-processes would help for moving source localization. And then, yeah, it might be interesting to look for a single ear shape model which has best performance of all the ears. And it's an open question if such a model exists or if that model outperforms the individual-agnostic model. That's an open question, but yeah, it's sort of interesting topic, I think. Another topic may be active binaural localization. So this is a slightly different context, but yeah, in robot audition, this is an interesting technique. But yeah, in robot audition, it's a slightly different context, because if you have a robot, you know the individual HRIR or set, I mean, catalog of that robot. So that's a slightly different context, but anyway. And yeah, one important topic is comparison with human perception. If we want to use this model as a substitute of human subjective evaluations, then this becomes a very crucial component here. And yeah, the application to source separation is also another interesting topic. Okay, I would like to thank Hannes, my mentor, again for the great research topic and continuous constructive feedback during the 12 weeks. I would like to thank Ivan for having me once again. I would like to thank David for technical support. I would like to thank Dimitra for organizing the wonderful morale event. So this background is a screenshot of the morale event. I really love this photo, this screenshot. I feel sorry that Dimitra is so small here in the corner, but it was awesome event, as you can see from all the smiles here. And I would like to thank the fellow interns and everyone in the Audio and Acoustic Research Group for sharing a very exciting, fun time. Thank you very much for your attention. I would like to answer any questions. Sorry for the break at the middle and the noise at the background.
Thank you, Shokan. Very nice talk. We have one question in the chat that maybe you want to respond to. Joel, do you want to ask a question yourself?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I was wondering if, I mean, you're making this assumption or making your life a lot harder by saying you don't want to have to know anything about the recording system, which is admirable. But I'm wondering if there's some way, you could just do a couple of, have some standard where somebody fires an impulse function or something like that, a delta function from a known location or a number of locations to sort of calibrate what that recording system is doing, and then feed that into your model to possibly get much better results.
Yeah, that's, I think, interesting future possible extension. So to sort of adapt the model to a specific target binaural recording system. Yeah, we haven't considered that in the scope of this project, but yeah, I think that's a potential interesting extension. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, not to just try to calibrate it for, I guess maybe I'm being too ambitious. I don't want to just calibrate it for train the model for a specific binaural recording, but I'm wondering if there's some way that the math would work out where if you had certain parameters of the binaural recording system, you could feed that into the model, and then the model could correct for that individual recording system without having to be retrained. Maybe that's too ambitious. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we may consider some sort of conditioned training with some set of given parameters. Yeah, I mean, it could be I think investigated. I think it's sort of an interesting idea.
One thing I could see related to that is the activation. So the output of the model right now is just an activation map. It doesn't output lateral and polar estimates or angle estimates. It just says, on the sphere, this is what I heard, so to say. And one thing you could potentially do is, if you have a particular binaural recording setup that uses a particular binaural head, for example, and you know that this binaural head is of a certain size, or you infer that from a measurement at a known location, you could potentially rescale or reproject that output activation map to the lateral and polar angles of that particular recording. So you wouldn't actually have to retrain the model at all. You could just distort or reproject the output of the model, and that could be that could in the lateral angle that might actually be quite useful.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good idea. Are there any other? I see that we're running right up against the hour. Are there any other questions from the audience on Shogun's talk?
I had one question about the sensitivity of the output of the model. I was wondering if you were to feed two different test signals into the model that are using the same HRTFs, except one is slightly degraded or modified in some way, like it might be low passed a little bit, would it output similar results or results that are at least adjacent or near each other?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I have tested that kind of cases, but I would expect that at least the lateral angle would be decently estimated. Not so sure about the polar angle, because the higher frequency components can be ported in that in the polar angle localization. But yeah, that could be one test case, I think. And yeah.
And I think Mick, you're actually touching here on one of the goals of this project going in was to see whether we could potentially replace a human subject. Not replace, but at least for some tests, use this as a predictor for human perception. And so exactly for things like comparing different HRTF sets or different binaural synthesis methods or recording methods, and use the model kind of as a stand-in to give us some sense for what might happen perceptually when we do that, when we change parameters or use different HRTF sets. It's a bold ambition, but it was one of the motivations going in.
Yeah, it would be amazing if we could use this to predict how our changes to HRTFs would modify human perception.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're quite there yet, but that's the ambition anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Jochen.
Any
I have
other?
a quick
Yeah.
question.
Mm-hmm.
So the output of your model is actually just a spatial activation map, right?
Yes.
But you kind of you call it localizer, and you also show some results on localization accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
So that means, especially also in multi-source scenarios, you would actually have to count the number of sources and kind of detect how many sources there are and do kind of a peak picking.
Yes, exactly.
And that's actually not a trivial thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I wonder how you did it. And
you're exactly right. So we didn't touch that problem for the multi-source case. I mean, for the single source case, as I mentioned, it's just taking the brightest direction basically. And yeah, for multiple sources, it's not trivial, and it would require some probabilistic post processes. And yeah, but that we didn't consider that within the scope of this project. That's but it would be definitely required for if you really want to localize multiple sources.
Yeah. Okay. So all the accuracy numbers and so on you showed are just for single source.
Yeah. These are for exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, excellent question. Anyone? Any last questions? Going once?
I had a quick question.
Okay.
If someone else,
Oh yeah.
If no one else has a question, I was wondering here in the results, the angular error for your proposed system on the seen data is pretty much similar with the unseen. I don't see a huge discrepancy or drop for the unseen data. A small, sure, but not a big one. And I was wondering if that's basically how do you explain that, and if that could be what may differentiate you from other studies as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. In the case of training without reverb, for example, that difference is pretty big. So in this case, I think the model is sort of overfitting to the clean train data here. But yeah, in other cases, I think it's so. I mean, it's not that overfitting. So it's sort of how to say. I'm not sure if we can call this underfitting, but
I guess, Shogun, what's probably happening here is that even if in the scene case, scene just means that the HRTF used for testing was part of the large set of HRTFs we use for training. Right. Yeah. So instead of using an HRTF that's completely unseen, you use one of the however many thousands you use to train. And so while it's technically there in training, the model probably doesn't really internally classify these different HRTFs and then try to detect the one that's used in testing and localize based on that, except maybe in the simpler cases where you don't have noise and reverb and you really just have clean speech samples with a known direction. It seems that there the model is actually able to overfit. So it looks like by adding these more challenging training conditions, you're preventing the model from overfitting, even if you use the same HRTF in training and testing.
Yeah, so if you look at the single subject models, it's pretty drastic, the difference between seen and unseen conditions. So if you have a train it on a single HRTF, then you really overfit to that and have a huge loss of performance if you use it in that with unseen data.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I think we should I think we should wrap up. Thank you very much, Shoken, once again.
Yeah, thank you.
Great work, great talk. And we'll end there. I'll stop the recording.